Yo, what's up guys? Chase the Bro here, and welcome back to another Elden Ring DLC update video. I recently learned about an interview between Miyazaki and Famitsu that actually gives a few more details about the upcoming DLC. So I thought it might be a good idea to read through, see if we can get any details regarding the DLC that weren't really shown or confirmed in the trailer. And if you guys have any information you'd like to share as you're watching with me, feel free to comment that below as well. Well, let's just begin. So I believe this is the beginning of the interview, but they're really just talking about the overall success of Elden Ring, how many units it's sold, how many it's sold in Japan. So I'm just going to look specifically for the details in regards to the Elden Ring DLC. And this seems to be that portion of the interview. So we have Shadow of the Erdtree was announced on February 28th, 2023, but the release date has finally been revealed after a year. The first thing I would like to ask you is, when did you start developing it? I've always wondered that as well, if they start development for the DLCs the second the game is released, so I guess we'll find out. I think it was towards the end of the main game's development that I started to vaguely imagine Miyazaki's DLC development. In the overall concept of Elden Ring, there were things that couldn't be included in the main story, and I thought it would be great if we could release those things to the world in the form of the DLC. Development of the DLC actually started after the release of the main game and after updates. Oh really? So they actually did some of the update patches before they even began work on the DLC. This is what I've been waiting for. Are there any weapons, magic, or incantations that will be added? Yes, many weapons, magic, battle techniques, I'm guessing they mean Ash of War here from the translation, will be added. That's one of the selling points of the DLC, especially regarding weapons. 8 new weapon types will be added. I find that insane because the actual base game of Elden Ring, I think, only added a few different weapon types than Dark Souls 3 had. We have heavy thrusting swords, that wasn't one in Dark Souls 3. A case could be made for twin blades because they didn't have that either, but twin blades were in Dark Souls 2, so for now we're not going to count that as a new weapon class. They've had that before. I suppose colossal weapons is a new class because we had ultra great swords, which were colossal swords, and great hammers, but we didn't have a class just for like colossal weapons. So 2 great spears are new, 3, and then we didn't have like ballistas or cannons really. We had bows and great bows. So overall, just 1, 2, 3, 4 new classes for a whole brand new game compared to the prior Souls game. Oh, and then there's flails. So 5 overall. And now we're going to get 8. That's amazing. I don't even know what type of weapons are going to be in it. We know we have the fists. I don't know if that's going to be a different weapon class, though, or if it's just going to be a fist class that just gets different combat abilities. I suppose we're going to see. And we've seen the dual daggers being thrown, but that could have been an Ash of War. The boomerang we saw in the trailer, though, that definitely seems like a different weapon class. And, of course, there are also additions to existing weapon types as well. So, yeah. 8. There are quite a number of weapons in the main game, but what kind of weapons will be added in the DLC? First of all, we have a direction that is relatively close to the classics, such as large Japanese swords, so maybe we're going to get large katanas. The large sword, I'm guessing great sword, and the Yateken. I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure what that is. But we also have a direction that is more distinctive and highly novel. For example, it might be fighting game inspired by a monk or something like a dueling shield that combines offense and defense. That was definitely that like twin blade looking shield weapon we've seen. There are also throwing daggers where all attacks are thrown. Like we thought, the moveset is actually just throwable daggers. I think even those who have already used the weapon types in the main story will find it refreshing and enjoyable. And then they say, I can feel the excitement again. What kind of fields will appear in the DLC? We have prepared something that is very different from the field in Miyazaki's main story. It includes not only open fields, but also legacy dungeons, smaller dungeons. It is larger and more diverse than the main story of Limgrave. So this is, I guess, where they confirm the size is of scale of Limgrave or bigger. And I wonder if they mean the Weaving Peninsula and Limgrave, because if it does, that's pretty huge, especially if it is more dense. They then asked how you access that area. You will be heading there not directly from the field in the main story, but by transfer. The entrance is either a large cracked cocoon or a withered arm hanging from it, which was the stage of the battle with Mohg, Lord of Blood. Also, in order to go to the field of the DLC, you need to defeat Mohg, Lord of Blood, and Radahn Starbreaker. So I guess that's kind of like an entry wall. They want you to be able to at least defeat Mohg before you go to the DLC. A lot of the prior Souls games had the DLC access, I guess pretty early. If you think of Dark Souls 3, you could access the Ashes of Ariandel from the Cathedral of the Deep, which is a pretty early area. So I'm going to guess that most of the bosses we're going to see in the DLC are fairly strong, or at least comparable in strength to Mohg or stronger. If you can play from the second half of the main story, what will the difficulty level be higher? And Miyazaki said that's right. I think the parametric difficulty level will be based on the later half of the main story. That's kind of what I thought, just because they're putting it behind a boss. That's pretty tough. Fundamentally, the approach to the difficulty remains unchanged in the original game. This is true in that you have the freedom to take on threats, and there are also challenging bosses that don't need to be defeated in the story, like the Millennia type in the main story. So they're going to have difficult bosses that are not mandatory, which we all enjoy. Millennia was definitely one of the more difficult fights in the game, and she isn't something you actually have to do to complete it, so. Is it possible to go back and forth between the main game field and the DLC? Yes, it is possible. As I answered earlier, the main game and DLC fields are not connected, so you can go back and forth between them by transferring, but you can do it freely. I was wondering that too, if we're going to always have to go to where the hand is in the Moog boss arena to travel into it, but it seems like they asked that as well. This is a small detail, but how will fast travel work? This is also the same as the main story. Once you discover a blessing, you'll be able to transfer there. So I wonder if you can just warp back and forth between them. I'm assuming maybe it'll be another layer of the map where that's the DLC and you just like click one of the analogs similar to the underground area. Will the progress of the DLC affect the ending of the main story? No, there is no such thing, and the progress of the events in the main story will not change the content of the DLC. Okay, so like I thought earlier, they're keeping all the NPCs and quest lines and everything probably separate. That way you can't ruin it by doing the DLC early or interacting with different quest lines. It's safe to assume the DLC story will be completed within the DLC. Okay. Are there any new elements unique to the DLC? And Miyazaki said, as for the system, level up elements limited to DLC have been added. I find that interesting, what they mean by level up systems specifically in the DLC. I think it's easy to understand if you imagine something like the offensive power in Sekiro. And if I remember correctly, upping your offensive power made you do more posture damage from a variety of things, right? Whether it was your regular attacks actually blocking and getting like the perfect blocks or parries to increase the posture damage. But apart from that, the conventional levels, there is offensive power that is only effective in the DLC field. This was prepared for the freedom to challenge the threats that I mentioned earlier, and it allows you to say things like, this boss is tough, so let's explore another area and try again after becoming stronger. This makes it easier to experience even at high levels. On the other hand, by suppressing the increase in offensive power, players will be able to experience the challenge of challenging threats at lower levels. Interesting. So they're adding a mechanic that maybe makes you do more damage overall, or like posture damage to the bosses where you get the crits on them easier after you break their poise. That's never really been done. I guess you can choose then if you have an easier time with the bosses without being like high level. By grinding levels, they wanted another mechanic to maybe make boss fights that people get stuck on easier. That'll be different to see. And then they ask, when I heard the title, the first thing that caught my attention was the meaning of the subtitle, Shadow of the Erd Tree. Miyazaki responded with, Erd Tree is the golden tree that appears in the main story, therefore, the direct translation of the DLC's subtitles is Shadow of the Golden Tree. In the concept art released in February 2023, the shadow of the golden tree towering in the back left is also known as the Shadow Tree. The setting of the DLC is not the land between, symbolized by the golden tree, but the land of shadows, symbolized by the Shadow Tree. Also, the subtitle has a slightly more hidden meaning, but I'd like you to experience that by actually playing the game. So like they mentioned here, the DLC is not in the lands between, it's going to be in the land of shadows. And when Lost and I were watching the DLC, we were kind of looking for landmasses, thinking that maybe this took place in the past. So we were looking for things that were similar on the map when it's entirely a different map. So that really does just confirm that it's an entirely different area, which is awesome. I like having a brand new map to play. One more thing related to the art, is the person riding Torrent one of the demigods whose existence is mentioned in the main story, Mikola of the Sacred Tree? And Miyazaki responded, yes, that's right, the main character of the story depicted in this DLC is Mikola. I'm not sure if people remember this, but the main story was simply about following the guidance of blessings. This time we'll be following the footsteps of Mikola, who is headed towards the land of shadows. Also, NPCs who follow Mikola's footsteps will also appear. They become the storytellers of the DLC, interact with the main character, and sometimes become friends and enemies. So I figured this would be the case, but we are getting NPCs specifically for the DLC. I wonder if any of the main area NPCs are going to carry over, and we'll see them there as well. But it's definitely seeming like we get separate NPCs entirely for the DLC area. They next asked, a lot of information has been revealed this time, so please tell us about it. You said earlier that Queen Marika's past will be told, but will the timeline of the DLC be in the past? This is what we originally thought, or at least I did, and Lost when we were speculating. But Miyazaki responded, no, the timeline will be the same as the main story. It is not set in the distant past or future. I think the past of the Land of Shadows and Queen Marika would be told in the same way as the history of the Shattered War in the main story. What is the main theme Mr. Miyazaki is trying to portray in Shadow of the Erd Tree? And Miyazaki said, that's difficult to answer. That's exactly what I want the users to experience. I don't think anything I say here will be bogus. So far they're just really covering the story of the DLC, but The main story of Elden Ring featured a heroic story, but will that change in the DLC as well? Yes, the theme of heroic stories remains the same. I think the character Mesmer, depicted in the key art, is easy to understand, and he is also one of the heroes. The chair that Mesmer is sitting on is the same chair that was used in the main story during the battle with the abominable King Morgott, and he's also a being on the same level as Godric, Malenia, Radon, Rykard, etc. So he's also called Marika's child. Yeah, you can definitely see from the throne and his manner that he's going to be one of the main demigods that you fight. They next asked if George R.R. Martin was also involved in drawing the DLC story. They definitely switched these, but Miyazaki said Martin's involvement is the same as in the main story. The world and story of the DLC, like that of the main story, was inspired by and constructed by the mythology he wrote. To be more precise, this DLC is part of what was inspired by his mythology during the production of the game. Therefore, there was no additional writing for the DLC, so they didn't bring him back in to write more for the DLC. That makes sense. What I'm curious about is the volume of the DLC. Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne were released about a year after the main game, so I have high expectations for this one. Yeah, when I think back, the first DLC for Dark Souls 3 actually came out in October, I believe. That was Ashes of Ariandel, so it wasn't even a year for the first DLC, and then we got the Ring City in 2017. So you got both DLCs in basically a 1-year span. And Miyazaki said, "That's right, we apologize for keeping you waiting. However, when it comes to the volume of the DLC, it is clearly larger than the DLC for the Dark Souls series or Bloodborne. I have no doubt about that. This will be our biggest DLC to date." And I don't think any of us are really surprised by that with the scale they tried to make Elden Ring in general. And then, that's more than I expected. Why did the volume become so huge? And Miyazaki said, "When we thought about Miyazaki's DLC to provide an Elden Ring-like experience, we felt the current volume was necessary. Although there are threats to overcome, there is a sense of adventure typical of Elden Ring, with the freedom to take on those challenges, the excitement of exploring the unknown, and discoveries and encounters at the end of the exploration." In the trailer released for this announcement, I would like to pay attention to the weapons as well. Also, the trailer featured an enemy I've never seen before, like a lion dancer, but is this a DLC boss? Ah yes, when we saw they were standing on each other, that was really interesting. Yes, the lion dance is in a sense a DLC-like boss. In fact, the Land of Shadows is the place where Marika became a god and the Golden Tree was born. Naturally, there was a culture that existed before the Golden Tree, and the lion dance character is derived from that culture. So I hope you can feel the scent of a different culture, which is a little different from the main story. Sometimes the translations are funny. In the background of the new art, something like a veil is depicted in the sky. Yes, the Land of Shadows, which is the DLC, is separated from the Land of Interstice, which is the setting of the main story. It has the image of being separated and hidden from the outside world, and the veil is also a symbol of this. The mystery will only deepen, but I'm looking forward to new encounters. This is a quick question, but will I be able to see the special ending if I clear the DLC area? I'm guessing Elden Ring's own ending, or rather, there is no one where the end credits play. However, the clearing of the DLC has been adjusted to make it clearer, and there are some small effects that will make you feel that way. So there's no end screen for repeating the DLC. After the DLC is released, will there be any DLC or other content created that further expands the world of Elden Ring? No, as of now, we have no plans for another DLC after this one. I think this will be a big break in terms of DLC added to the main game of Elden Ring. However, that does not mean that everything in Elden Ring is complete. I may have said the same thing about Dark Souls 3, but I don't want to make any statements that would close off future possibilities. So at the moment, they're not planning it. I mean, they weren't even working on the original DLC at the release of the game. I was kind of surprised about that. In addition to the DLC alone, it has also been decided to release a bundled version that includes the main game of Elden Ring and the DLC. Yes, I would be very happy if someone took the opportunity to play Elden Ring for the first time. So they're saying you can buy the base game with the DLC to maybe include for people that have never played Elden Ring before. As I mentioned earlier, in order to enter the DLC field, you need to have progressed through the main story to a certain extent. So I think it would be a good idea to have players complete the main story before the DLC is released. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I would prefer them have like a wall like Moog be in place for the DLC. That way they're free to make more challenging bosses and make the difficulty a little bit harder. I didn't expect to go into the DLC and have the enemies doing small damage. The DLCs are usually harder areas than most of the game itself for the Souls games. Although the DLC has not yet been released, what is your feeling when you look back on Elden Ring itself now that it has come to conclusion? The DLC development is not yet completely finished, so I can't quite put myself in that state of mind. Yeah, I guess they still have 4 months, right? A lot could change in 4 months. When I'm working on something, whether it's the main game or the DLC, I'm always desperately wishing for more development time. But when it's finished, I realize that I've been working on it for a really long time. I feel it. Of course, there were many hardships involved, but above all, it was a really fun time. Everyone involved, including the staff on the development team, was an amazing group of people, and working with Mr. Martin was an honor and an exciting experience. I may get scolded for saying this, but for me, I make games not just for work, but also for my purpose in life, and in that sense, Elden Ring was a unique experience. I really feel lucky to have so many wonderful users, I can't help but feel grateful. Miyazaki the Wholesome. Here's an interesting question too for further things in the future. So, do you have any desire to make another game on the scale of Elden Ring? Yes, there is. I don't know if it's something I can start working on right away, but if it's allowed, I'd like to give it a try. I'm sure all the staff feel the same way, but I want to make use of the experience I gained from working on Elden Ring. Above all, creating a big world and adventure is really fun and exciting. The story follows Miquella's footsteps towards the Land of Shadows, and the story depicts the past of the Land of Shadows and Queen Marika. Unseen formidable enemies will be challenged by making full use of newly introduced weapons, what I'm most excited for. As you guys know, PvP is kind of what keeps me playing Elden Ring for years after release or updates, and the more weapons and abilities, the more fun I have. There are still many things to be concerned about, but first of all, we are happy that the release date has been decided. So am I. And the players who are about to start from here and descend into the lands between have already overcome many difficulties and become heroes of war. Even if you're a current player, be prepared for what's to come. That is actually a really good interview. We got some really good information out of that. 8 new weapon classes is probably the highlight of it for me. I honestly can't imagine what all the classes are going to be unless they're like subcategories of certain weapon types. Maybe we will get a bow staff. The boomerang was really cool. Maybe a great katana. You know, that's like the only regular class of weapon that doesn't have a great version. That's really all there is to the interview. If you guys have any comments or anything you'd like to share, always feel free to comment those below. I feel like this was definitely insightful. We learned a few things that are important to me at least. I'll try my best to keep you guys updated with any information we get regarding the DLC, but this is the end of the video for today. Thank you guys so much for watching and reading along. I'll see you all next time. Goodbye. Goodbye.